Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the last day of Dreamforce. Can you believe it? You're the survivors. Give yourself a hand. Clap even louder if you're relieved that it's finally the last day of Dreamforce. And clap even louder if you wish there was at least one more day or maybe one more week. Yeah, I'm with you there. There's so much to learn and do. Raise your hand for me, please, if you consider yourself primarily to be an administrator, an admin. Great, thank you. Welcome to the developer zone. Wow. And raise your hand if you consider yourself to be a developer already. Could be both, right? Excellent. Great. Glad to see you all in the room. We're going to be talking about Apex triggers. It says for advanced admins. It's for everybody. We're going to talk about basics and best practices for business automation. My name is Bonnie Hinners, and I am local here in San Francisco. I'm one of the co-leaders for the San Francisco Bay Area nonprofit user group. If you haven't found your local user group, you should look for it online. Groups meet locally, and they also have online forums for people to ask questions and discuss issues. There's all kinds of resources in the success community. You can find me in the success community. I think I'm probably the only Bonnie with a Y. So very easy to search, but if you spell it wrong, you won't find me. Sorry, spelling counts on the internet, right? You can also find me on Twitter at SnugSFBay. That stands for Salesforce Nonprofit User Group San Francisco Bay Area. But SnugSFBay. And I'd look forward to hearing from you guys about what kind of triggers you're going to build after today's session. And hopefully you'll have some understanding of best practices as you do that. This is the forward-looking statement. Has anyone seen this yet at Dreamforce? Raise your hand if you've seen this at least once. I don't even work for Salesforce, so if I tell you anything about what they're doing in the future, do not base your purchasing decisions on what I think they're going to do in the future. Base it on your own investigation of the current state of the product and company. Now, we're here to talk about Apex because Apex is the programming language on the Salesforce platform that orchestrates your business processes. This is how you create those automations that are unique to what your company is trying to do. You can help ensure your data integrity by making sure that the data looks and feels the way it's supposed to automatically. You can also kind of ease the path for the end users by taking care of some of those tedious tasks for them. The very first building block for these business automations is your Apex trigger. The trigger is the magic that happens automatically. Triggers listen to the data in your database, and they conduct the movement and the timing of all those automations that need to go into place. So that's just one block in the whole automation process. Another block is Apex classes. Now, classes are a way to organize your code so that you have specific classes for specific jobs or specific automation needs or specific business process needs. That way you can go in and maintain that code more easily, add to it, fix it, make it better going forward. And the last building block that you need to be concerned with are Apex tests. The Apex unit tests allow you to validate your business processes before you actually give your code or your automation to your end users. So you want to find the problems before they do. You want everything to be perfect before they ever see it. So we're going to talk about how those three fit together. Anybody here using Trailhead to learn about Salesforce? Hopefully you're all going to raise your hand. Yeah, I'm using Trailhead. See, I've even got my little Trailhead tail on today. If you haven't spun the wheel over in the admin zone to win a prize, this is what I won. You know, Astro has this tail. He's the Trailhead mascot, and it's also like that Mario tail if you play Mario at all, when you power up with the little leaf. So Trailhead lets you power up. I encourage you to go and do the trailhead trail on Apex triggers. It's a great place to start. I'm not going to just step through that, okay? I'm going to try to fill in some blanks between some of those trailhead modules so that you can actually know a little bit more than what you can discover on your own. Okay, tip number 1, Apex trigger. We want 1 trigger per object at most. Right? If you're not doing an automation on an object, you're not going to have a trigger. But if you are going to have some automations on an object, if you're listening for changes to data on that Salesforce object, so objects like accounts, contacts, or custom objects that you've built in your org, you only want 1 trigger per object because your trigger is kind of like your drum major. It's going to be the thing that conducts that action on the field, right? And you don't want to have a bunch of different drum majors running around trying to tell all the band members to do something different. You want to have 1 out there that tells all the different band members how to behave and when to do their thing. We talked about the Apex classes. Those are the individual players, the performers, the things that actually do the automation. So we're going to have our trigger that indicates it's time for a particular instrument, if you will, to play its part in that automation. And those automations should be grouped according to what it is they're performing, just the way band members are grouped. Now here we've got, this is what we want it to look like when everybody's looking. Nice uniforms, everything lined up perfectly. That's what we want our org to be like. Very organized. We want all those end users, when their eyeballs are on Salesforce, to see the data they want to see and not find any problems. And the way to do that is with Apex testing. We want to make sure we're running through what the end user is going to see in an automated fashion that we can repeat on the fly when we have configuration changes in our org, when we have code changes in our org, and 3 times a year when Salesforce gives us a new release and new functionality, we want to make sure the stuff we've built continues to work. So in those pre-release sandboxes, we can run those automated tests and make sure everything's working going forward. This is an example of the code recommended by the Trailhead Trail for building a trigger. It's code that will trigger on accounts. Let's see. We know sorry, my laser pointer's not working. Oh, there it is. We know it's a trigger. That first word on line 1 tells us it's a trigger in the code. Then we have a very long name that gives us a little bit of info about what we intend from this trigger. It's an accounts with context trigger. It's listening to the account object, and it's going to handle what takes place before we can delete an account. So if a user is trying to delete, Salesforce and our trigger are going to step in before that deletion takes place. It's going to look for a contact on that account, and it's going to block deletion of accounts that have contacts. Does anybody know what happens if you delete an account that has a contact? What happens to those contacts? Raise your hand if you know. Okay, you. Either of you. Simultaneously, you have to both say it. The contacts do not get deleted, actually. You might think that would be what happens. Okay, next. What happens when you delete? They get orphaned. And what does that mean? We have another volunteer. What does it mean when a contact gets orphaned? It becomes private. And when it becomes private, only one person even knows that that contact exists anymore. Only the person who owns that contact. It's data that is almost unusable at that point. So we want to block deletion of accounts that have contacts. And that's what this trigger is all about. In lines 4 through 6, it's telling us that for every account that's being deleted, we want to look and see in our database if we can find the account ID in a list of contacts. If that account ID exists in all of our contacts, we don't want to delete it. Instead, what we want to do is put up this error message: cannot delete account with related contacts. Because part of our business automation and our business rules includes giving valuable and meaningful information to our end users. We don't want to just block the account from being deleted. We want to let them know why they can't delete that. So this is a basic trigger, and it works really well. This, again, it's straight out of Trailhead. You can build this in your org through Trailhead. And all it does is listen on the account record for records that are being deleted, and then automates what happens. Pretty straightforward, but trigger context can be a lot more elaborate than that. We can have insert context. So we may have an automation that takes place when records are inserted, brand new records going into our database. We might have things that we want to do before a record gets inserted to make sure that a particular set of data is added to it. Maybe we want to assign a particular owner based on the kind of data in that record. We want to also maybe do some automations after the record is inserted, like sending a task or assigning a task to that new record owner. Those are all things you can do with a trigger on that specific context. And I've got these two guys standing there representing this sort of simplicity of, just taking care of two things, two different contexts. But it can get pretty complex pretty quickly, because we also have the context of update. Maybe the record already exists and we're updating the information. The update could cause us to need to change the owner. Maybe we need to assign a new task to the record owner's manager to look into what's going on with this. So we can see that things are getting a little more complicated. We have a few more players on the field there. They're even camouflaged, so it's a little harder to maintain and understand what's going on. And then we get even more complex, right? We've got the context of record deletion. We might want to block a deletion from happening. So before it gets deleted, check and see what kind of record it is and see if it's valid to delete it. Maybe after we delete it, we want to send an email to the person who deleted it and say, hey, you just deleted this and now it's gone, just in case they accidentally deleted it. So our field has gotten a little more complex. That's OK Go, by the way. I stole these shots from one of their videos. And finally, we've also got the context of undelete. When that user deleted that record, got that email from the system automatically saying, hey, you deleted it, now it's gone forever. They might decide they made a mistake and go into the recycle bin and undelete it. And maybe there's something I want to do after the record gets undeleted. Maybe I need to go in and make sure that it's assigned to a new owner so that person can't delete it anymore. But now the field is a lot more complex. And when I need to maintain that code or update that code, the automation code, how am I going to find the right player out of all of that? It's kind of difficult when everything's jammed into one place. So the solution is separate the performers. Over here we've got the Bremen Town musicians from the conductor, our crazy little squirrel. But in reality, in Salesforce, the conductor and the performers are going to be handler classes for the performers and our trigger as the conductor. So this is my account deletion handler. This is what I've named this class. It's a public class on line 1. Public just means that it's available throughout my Salesforce org for any Salesforce processes to use, or not processes, but as an automation within my org that can fire at any time. And I'm calling it account deletion handler because that's the business process that it handles. Handlers handle the business process. So it's handling what happens on account deletion. It's the same basic code that we saw before in the Apex trigger. I just pulled that code out of the trigger and put it into an Apex class. So lines 3 through 15 are a method that does what that trigger was doing, the trigger from the Trailhead exercise. We're going to look at the accounts that are being deleted. It could be multiple accounts, right? This might not be a single user action. It might be something the admin is doing via data loader, so it could be a pile of accounts all at once. And we're going to make sure that the delete list does not occur to happen to also occur in our list of contacts. So if it's an account ID on an existing contact, I want to put up that error message again, please reparent contact records before deleting. And I'm going to return that data, that error map that I've created, to my trigger, or to whatever code happens to call this class. Because now that I've separated this business process into its own class, I can call that from other code in my org. I could call it from other triggers. I could set it up so that I could call it from a workflow or a process builder or flow. Any place I might need this sort of behavior, I can reuse this code now that I've separated it from my trigger. But I need to change my trigger now because I'm pulling that functionality out of the trigger and simplifying the trigger so that it's just the conductor, right? Now my account trigger, I've renamed it to be simply account trigger. It's going to operate on the account, but it can now handle all of the different conditions, including the undelete after undelete. And so the code inside my trigger now just needs to examine what conditions have occurred that have caused the trigger to fire so that we understand what context we're trying to automate and act on. In this case, lines 4 and 5 define the context. We're looking to see if it's a delete that's happening in our database. And if it is a delete, are we currently acting before the record gets deleted? If so, then this is what we're going to do. We're going to call that in line 7. We're going to call that account deletion handler class. And we're going to call the block with contacts, block that deletion with contacts. And we're going to look at all of the old data that the trigger is trying to operate on. So that list of accounts that the admin's trying to delete, or that one account that the user's trying to delete. And then we're going to just make sure that error message gets put on those accounts and that they're not deleted. I could have blocks of code like this defining all of my different contexts, my context for inserting records, updating records, undeleting records. So the trigger can get quite complex, even though it's not actually handling the business process itself. So that makes everything a lot easier to maintain. I can just look here and find out what happens in each context, and then go to the class that actually takes care and handles that process. Now, practice makes perfect. Remember we said we want to make sure that everything works right before our end users actually see this in place. We want to make sure we know what we're doing. These guys don't look like they know what they're doing because their backs are to the band. But you know what? That is what they wanted to be doing. So practice makes perfect. Run the tests as part of your development process. It's a great way to make sure that your business process aligns with what your code is doing. And if your unit tests are written in a way that mirrors your business process, you can make sure that that code is working anytime on the fly by running it. So I had a couple of tests fail. I got a system assert exception that meant that my business process was broken. Edited my code and reran my tests, and this is all in the Apex test execution section. Now remember, when you're running unit tests, it's like practice. You don't practice in full uniform every single time. And just like you don't practice in full uniform every time, you don't practice Apex. You don't run those Apex tests on your end user data. Your tests don't need to see the same thing your end users see. In fact, you don't really want it to, right? Your tests shouldn't mess with end user data, and your end users don't want to see test data. In their reports, they don't want test data. So keep your data separate in tests from your org data. And the way to do that is with a test data silo. This is another test class that I've created. You can tell it's a test class because line 1 starts out with the annotation, the @ sign, is test. And this class is going to create some test data. The first method, public static void, create accounts, contacts, and opportunities, ACO, actually uses this one bit of code, the test.loadData, to pull up different CSV files that I've loaded as static resources. I put my admins in charge of data. That includes test data. So I've asked them to create CSV test data files for us to use, for us to load as test data. And I want them to create data that mirrors what they expect to see from our users at different points in the process. So these are CSV files that exist in my static resources, and this is a method that easily loads those as test data. So it's really easy to create test data, keep it separate from our org data. And we're going to run those tests and make sure that everything is working right when no one's watching, right? We've got the @IsTest annotation. This is the actual test that's going to validate our business process. And we're running on lines, line 4 through 6, we're running test setup. This is the bit that just creates that test data for us to look at, because we can't test deleting an account unless we've set up an account, right? So we're going to set up some accounts with contacts, some accounts without contacts. That's all the way that those CSV files were created. We're going to load those in our test data silo. And then we're going to have another test method that tests whether or not we're actually blocking deletion. Because I've got 2 business rules here that I'm trying to automate, basically. One business rule is when an account has a contact, don't delete it. Block deletion. So line 23 actually double checks, did we block deletion? And if that fails, I'm going to get an error message, right? But the other business rule is I want there to be a meaningful message that goes to my end users. I don't want to just block them from doing things without letting them know what's happening. So I also have a system assert statement here that gets the error message and makes sure it's the error message I wanted it to be. Now, the sort of meat of this test is where we've created the test data, and then we try to delete a record. In this case, we're trying to delete a record that is associated with a contact. So when I try to do that in a test, it should give me an error. I want to catch the error, make sure it's a meaningful error, and I want to make sure that nothing was deleted. I should add to this test, though. That's not quite enough, because I want to make sure that I actually can still delete an account that doesn't have a contact. And then down the road, actually, I think I want to keep people from deleting accounts that have opportunities associated with them, too. So that's going to become even more complex. I'm really glad I pulled my code out into its own class. Just to review, we've got our Apex trigger. That's going to define the context for our business rules. We've got our Apex classes. Those handle the specific business rules, the jobs associated with the automations. We've got our Apex test that just takes care of our data silo and creates test data that's separate from our end user data. And we have our Apex test that exercises the business automations and make sure that things work the way our business rules say they should work. We've got, in the examples I gave you, the account deletion test. And when we're actually exercising our code and doing our development process, I start with the test so I know what my business rules are and I know that they're documented in my test. The test is going to call my create test data to make sure that I've got the kinds of data I need to prove that my business process works. And it's going to do the kind of behavior that my account trigger is listening for. When that account trigger hears what's happening from my deletion test, it's going to call the account deletion handler. It's going to take care of all my business rules for me. That puts it all together so that we can make sure that we have a really great performing system when our end users are paying attention to what's going on. We don't want any errors when they're actually seeing the action. If you want more resources, you can visit my blog at www.snugsfbay.com. I've got a blog post on creating CSVs for test data and some sample code for loading that test data. I've got that whole Create Test Data class on my blog. And the trailheads that I recommend that you go and play with are the Apex triggers and testing Apex triggers. Testing Apex triggers will give you a good start on unit testing. And I don't actually know how much time we have, but I think we've got a couple of minutes left for questions if you've got any. Thank you all for coming, and I am open to questions from the mic, or you can come up to the stage if you'd like as well. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of the show. Thank you. Yep. Oh, wait, sorry.
When you create that test data,
Yes.
does it remain in the org, or does the test delete it after it's done?
It just exists in the world of the test. It never actually hits the org exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, so it does sort of hit the org, because if you don't have it set up to have its own auto-generated auto-numbering, then sometimes if you've got auto-numbering, you might find, hey, there's 4 numbers missing. What happened to those records? That's probably a test data situation. So you have to actually check in your test setup that it's going to have independent auto-numbering.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's in memory on the cloud or on the
Well, it's all in the
running?
cloud. It's all in the cloud.
It's not
But
running
it never
on the device,
touches.
it's running.
Yeah, it never touches your user data.
But other triggers, like we have triggers that assign account team members and things like that, those will all kick in.
Oh, yes. So when you're testing triggers, you want to see everything operating together. And you want to take all those account triggers and put them in one trigger.
Yeah.
Move the actual business handling code into its own classes. That way you can make sure that things fire when they are supposed to. If you've got multiple triggers on a single account object, for example, and you make a change that could cause 2 different triggers to fire, Salesforce can't guarantee which trigger is going to go first.
Right.
Basically, it's essentially random. This time it might be your unmanaged package that fires first, and the next time it could be a managed package trigger that fires first.
So can you put clauses in that says, if I'm running a test, don't do these things?
Of course, you can always look for, whether or not whether tests are running, whether other conditions are, you can absolutely do that kind of logic inside a unit test as well.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.